The Black Cat and the Cask of Amontillado belong to a group of murder tales that includes The Telltale Heart and The Imp of the Perverse, all of which are narrated in the first person by the murderer himself and contain elements of dramatic monologue. The narrator is placed in an implied location, such as a prison cell, and addresses his speech to someone who seems to be present with him, someone who is not necessarily the reader. In all these stories, the narrator recounts his crime in graphic detail, attempts to explain his motivation for doing it, and describes his effort to keep it concealed, which always fails, with each story resulting in a confession of guilt. The Black Cat was first published in August 1843 in the United States Saturday Post, later the Saturday Evening Post, under the heading Original Tales, and it fills the first 3 columns of the front page. The story appeared roughly 7 months after The Telltale Heart, and the pair share in common Poe's interest in the concept of perversity, which he would elaborate on a couple years later in The Imp of the Perverse, which I talked about last time. Our other story, The Cask of Amontillado, which is one of Poe's best-known stories and is still frequently read by schoolchildren, was published in 1846, after all the other stories in this group. It originally appeared in Godey's Magazine and Lady's Book. This was one of the first successful American magazines oriented towards female readers. For 40 years, it was edited by Sarah Josepha Hale, who contributed articles on women's education and domestic economy. She gave us the poem Mary's Lamb, Mary Had a Little Lamb. She was also instrumental in creating the National Thanksgiving holiday, and several of Poe's stories were published in Godey's under her editorship. We'll come back around to The Cask of Amontillado later in this video. We're going to start now with The Black Cat. Like the narrator of The Telltale Heart, the speaker in this story attempts to remove any suspicion we might have of his sanity. "Mad am I not," he says, "and very surely do I not dream." Later, he asserts that he's detailing a chain of facts. Yet these facts are so extraordinary, so unusual, he anticipates the unlikelihood that they will ever be believed, frequently describing them in paradoxical terms. In the first sentence, for example, he introduces the story as being at once most wild, yet most homely. And again, a few lines later, he describes it as a series of mere household events, implying something rather ordinary than inexplicable. And yet he goes on to say that these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. He coaxes the reader into believing his story by appealing to our superior reasoning capabilities. Hereafter, perhaps some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace, some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail with awe, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. This is very clever. The narrator wants us to believe in the truth of his story, and we want to as well, so that we may have the pleasure of providing a logical explanation where he apparently cannot. Poe loves playing these kinds of games with the reader, and we'll revisit this when we come to The Fall of the House of Usher, William Wilson, and The Premature Burial. Take a look now at some themes and motifs in this story. We'll talk about perversity, that should be familiar, alcohol, and hauntings. While Poe's most sustained and coherent explanation of the perverse is to be found in The Imp of the Perverse, published 2 years after The Black Cat, we see an early formulation of it here as the narrator, aggravated by the sight of the hideous injury he had previously done to the cat, describes an increasing and irresistible impulse to destroy the animal once and for all. It was, he says, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit, he writes, philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination, in the teeth of our best judgment, to violate that which is law merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. He first injures the cat by carving out its eye with a knife, which action he attributes to intoxication after one of his bouts of drinking. Several times throughout the story, he mentions his struggle with drink, the fiend intemperance, as he puts it, and its tendency to make him violent. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. In connection with this story, readers have often made note of Poe's own struggles with alcohol, which strained relationships and sabotaged his career on several occasions, though there's no indication that he ever harmed his wife or any creature for that matter, but he was no doubt acutely aware of the prevalence of such abuses in society, commonplace enough surely to be classed among other mere household events. The danger of alcohol is a motif that will surface in several other tales, including, of course, the Cask of Amontillado. Moving on finally to hauntings, Poe is often thought of as a writer of ghost stories, and while it's not inaccurate to say so, it is susceptible of overstatement. Of the several stories we've read so far, The Black Cat is the first to contain any kind of supernatural element. It is more usually the case with Poe that a bizarre, seemingly supernatural event will turn out to have some logical explanation, and one always has to bear in mind that he rarely gives us rational, trustworthy narrators. Yet this story, The Black Cat, certainly contains elements of the supernatural. For one thing, there's the mysterious appearance of his dead cat's silhouette after his house burns down, for which his attempt at a rational explanation seems utterly preposterous. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by some one of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Even if one manages to find some remote plausibility in this explanation, the appearance of the second cat, Pluto's double, which is observed by several other characters as well, makes this a story of supernatural revenge. The narrator's sudden and shocking murder of his wife, then, is of less importance than the wanton killing of his cat Pluto. His wife, in other words, becomes the instrument of the cat's vengeance. When it first appears, Pluto's double seems to materialize out of thin air. I'd been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, he tells us, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object, that is the cat, thereupon. The spectral nature of this cat is manifest in the climactic scene of the story, leading up to the discovery of the narrator's appalling crime. Rather perversely, in a manner similar to the conclusion of The Telltale Heart, he reveals to the investigators, with hardly any pressure on him to do so, what up to this point has been a perfect murder. To conceal his nervousness during the search of his premises, he becomes unduly chatty. In the rabid desire to say something easily, he says, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. He then inadvertently draws attention to the very area of the house he should most want to avoid. His knocking on the brick wall with his cane precipitates the cat's vengeance. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud, and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman. A howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony and of the demons that exult in damnation. I love that passage. Not long after this, we discover that the narrator has, completely unawares, sealed the spectral cat behind the wall with the decomposing corpse of his wife. In the Cask of Amontillado, it is not a cat, but a human being, the most unfortunate Fortunato, that gets walled up, and this time, of course, it's a deliberate act. In 1844, Poe published the story Mesmeric Revelation in the Columbian Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine, and in that same issue, a piece by Joel T. Headley titled A Man Built in a Wall gives an account of the discovery of a skeleton behind the wall of an ancient church in Italy, providing evidence of the practice of live burial in medieval times. Headley delights in imagining how the scene may have unfolded. I will read a short excerpt that certainly would have delighted Poe, and that almost as certainly inspired him to write The Cask of Amontillado. At length the solid wall rose over his chest, repressing its effort to lift with the breath, when a stifled groan for the first time escaped the sufferer's lips, and a shudder ran through his frame that threatened to shake the solid mass which enclosed it to pieces. Yet up went the mason work till it reached the mouth, and the rough fragment was jammed into the teeth and fastened there with mortar, and still rose till nothing but the pale, white forehead was visible in the opening. With care and precision, the last stone was fitted in the narrow space. The trowel passed smoothly over it. A stifled groan, as if from the center of a rock, broke the stillness. One strong shiver, and all was over. The agony had passed. Revenge was satisfied, and a secret locked up for the great revelation day. The narrator of Poe's story, Montresor, is much different from the other murderers we've encountered so far. Cold, cruel, calculating, in full control of his actions from the moment he lures Fortunato into the crypts beneath his house until he lays the last brick, sealing him in his final resting place. Montresor does not exhibit the impulsive qualities of perversity we observed in the others. The story does take the form of a confession, but it is the confession of a man, presumably an elderly man, who has evaded justice for the last 50 years. These circumstances, the tone of the narration, Montresor's conduct, and the manner in which he executes his revenge — you may have noticed there's more dialogue between the murderer and his victim than in any of the other stories — and the distance between the time the murder was committed and the time of his confession, all these things lead us to very different questions than the other stories. First, of what offense is Fortunato guilty? The narrator never says. He speaks of an insult, but offers no further explanation. Obscure hints are sprinkled throughout the story, but nothing definitive. What does seem clear is that Montresor has been made to feel inferior to Fortunato. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved, he says beguilingly as he lures his victim deeper into the catacombs. You are happy as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. For his part, Fortunato acts as though he has no reason to suspect Montresor's motives. If there was an insult, one flagrant enough to provoke a murderous response, Fortunato seems completely ignorant of the fact to the very end. The absence of a clear motive contributes to our growing uneasiness as we read this story. We are made witnesses to a carefully premeditated crime, and a particularly cruel and horrific one at that, and yet there's nothing to help the reader make sense of it. And though we might feel some sympathy for Fortunato as the hapless victim of Montresor's strange mania, he remains relatively flat. We learn that he's Italian, Montresor seems to be French, that he's a mason, that he's married, he's a connoisseur of wine, he might suffer from allergies, but not much else. And this absence of humanizing traits, his confinement within the text, behind the wall of the narrator's words, dampens any strong feelings of pity for him or outrage towards Montresor. This, too, I think, contributes to any uneasiness we might feel reading the story. If we consider the story as a dramatic monologue, there's also the question of the narrator's interlocutor. To whom is Montresor speaking? Knowing that 50 years have passed since he committed the crime, and knowing that he has not been caught, nor even, it seems, been suspected in all that time, it seems reasonable to ask why he has chosen to speak now and to whom. A substantial hint is provided in the second sentence of the story. You who so well know the nature of my soul. Surely he can be addressing himself to no stranger here. Who would know his soul? It could be a close friend or a family member, but it seems rather more likely to me that he's speaking to a priest, quite possibly from his deathbed, confessing his mortal sins prior to facing the judgment of God, and perhaps realizing as well the full enormity of his crimes against Fortunato, that he deprived Fortunato not only of life, but also the sanctity of last rites, walled him up alive, and left him to suffocate in the cold and dark, without comfort, without solace, without spiritual counsel. This irony is suggested by Montresor's last sentence, a phrase from Latin funeral prayers, in pace requiescat, rest in peace. It is unclear if he's addressing Fortunato here, whose remains have lain undisturbed, unblessed, unburied for 50 years, or if they are rather directed inward, having disburdened himself of the guilt of his crimes. And Poe, as is so often the case, seems perfectly content to leave us with this ambiguity. That brings us to the end of this video.